Of all the stupid things to have to fight, like it's literally as dumb as the flat earths. Again, just think about what puberty does and you're stopping that or interfering with that. You would expect it to have very wide-ranging effects right through the body and the brain. It's your right to grow up to be an independent human being. It's your right to go through this process that turns you into someone who can go out into the world. You have had your puberty blocked and you're telling everybody that you're the opposite sex. You can't use the opposite sex's toilets. You can't go into their changing room. You can't do their sports. It's increasingly becoming clear you can't make everybody else call you the sex that you wish you were. So why the hell are we pretending?
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Helen Joyce. Helen, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
It's great to have you back on again. Always a pleasure to talk to you. There's a lot I want to catch up with you about, but it would be remiss of me not to kick off with this puberty blocker issue. You know, I'm one of those people who is quite optimistic and thinks that the trans craziness is fading away. And then I see these headlines about a massive puberty blocker experiment being carried out in the UK. And I'm like, oh no, we're back here again. So could you explain to us what exactly is happening with this trial that's going on right now?
Okay, so Hilary Cass, Dr. Hilary Cass, who's now Baroness Cass, when she brought out her groundbreaking report into child gender medicine, her headline finding was that as far as the interventions that are used for children are concerned, there is almost no good evidence. There's some extremely poor quality evidence. And the treatments that were being used, the hormonal treatments that were being used within the NHS were things called puberty blockers, which are powerful drugs that shut off the signals that start puberty, like it sounds. And that's a signal that goes between the brain and the gonads, the testicles and ovaries. And those were being used to sort of postpone the point at which you start to make the change into adulthood, which makes it harder if you later decide that you want an operation to try to look like the opposite sex. So these were being given to children under 16 in order to delay to 16 the point at which you might take cross-sex hormones, which have irreversible physical effects. So this pathway to treatment has been around for maybe 30 years, used a lot in America, Australia and Canada in recent years, and used relatively cautiously in the UK from about 2014. A bit before that, but from 2014 it picked up. And there's no evidence that it's a good idea and increasing evidence that it causes physical and mental harm to children, as well as the obvious thing that it stops your puberty, and puberty is very important and a major developmental stage. And this idea that it gave you time to think before you went on to irreversible treatment also turned out to be false. Literally nearly every child who goes on puberty blockers will end up going on cross-sex hormones, like as in 97-98%. So Wes Streeting, after getting the Cass report, decided, it was actually the previous health secretary under the Tories, and then Wes extended it, decided to ban the use of puberty blockers in the UK entirely, both publicly and privately, except in the context of a properly structured experiment that could actually give the sort of evidence that Dr. Cass said was not there. And that's what they finally decided to do. Now, is that a good idea? No, it's not a good idea. Is the research that they're doing well constructed? No. Are they going to face legal challenges? Yes. So the best sort of medical research, and most drugs aren't ever subjected to this, most of the things we use, especially on children, have not been through this sort of procedure, is what's called a randomized controlled trial, which is where you get a whole group who are suitable for whatever the treatment is. You randomly decide to give the treatment to one group and not the other. Ideally, nobody knows who's on which arm of the trial. Sometimes you have to know because it's obvious, because there are side effects to the treatment that are visible. And then afterwards, you're able to tell what the treatment did, because you can compare people who got it with people who are statistically identical who didn't. You can't do that with puberty blockers because you can see who's got them, because they don't go into puberty. So what they've done is they've got 200 and something kids, and they're going to randomise them to get puberty blockers straight away or get them in a year's time. And they think that that'll give them some comparison without ever having children who decide to drop out because they haven't got the puberty blockers. That's what they were afraid of, because kids have been told, propagandized, I should say, by lobby groups that these things are life-saving. That's the expression that's used. It's also not true. Cass found that. So that's their way of keeping kids in the trial. It's a small number. They're only going to be following them for a maximum of 2 years. That's not going to tell you anything about what happens to them into adulthood. It's not going to tell you anything about do they all go on to cross-sex hormones, what happens to their bone density, what happens to their brains, what happens to their IQs. Do they ever regret? There's a whole load of things it can't possibly tell you with that design. And instead of doing this, what they could have done is they could have looked at the 2,000 kids who've already been given puberty blockers. The disadvantage there is that they didn't do a sort of standardized intake for those kids. They didn't check things like their IQ, their bone density. So they can't say, oh, this kid went in at this level and now 7 years, 10 years, whatever later, this kid's at this level. But it's 2,000 kids. So they can do things like just check what their IQ is now, just check what their bone density is now. And if they're average, well, okay, that tells us something. If they're a lot lower than average, that tells us something too, because that's not likely to have happened by chance. But they're not doing that. Instead, they're going straight on to this RCT. I mean, I'm actually amazed that it got ethical approval.
One thing that so many gender-critical voices have faced is censorship and cancellation. They've had to fight hard against a relentless campaign to have them silenced. Thankfully, when it comes to online censorship, there is an easy and effortless way to beat it, thanks to our partners Private Internet Access, or PIA for short. PIA is the VPN I use and trust. In case you don't know, a VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Whenever you are browsing online on an unprotected device, your device is transmitting a lot of information out into the open, which can be seen by multiple parties before it reaches the website you're trying to visit. Instead of giving away your personal information and location to the world, PIA lets you change your IP address to one of 91 countries. This means you can gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. And it's not just that. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogues of content, but you can only access a fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. I love it. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema and being forced to sit in the hallway. I also use it all the time when I'm traveling to catch up with what's going on at home. Because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or my privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Macs, iPhones, Androids, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all the devices you own. So, sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Viewers of my show can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. So that's just £1.67 a month. And you also get an extra 4 months thrown in completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/Brendan. That's piavpn.com/Brendan. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You won't regret it. Sign up now at piavpn.com/Brendan. Yeah, I'm amazed too, and you've described it, that you've outlined it there very well, and quite chillingly, I might say. That's not your fault, that's the fault of this trial taking place in the first place. What's the logic behind it? Is it the possibility that these drugs might be unbanned if it's found that they're not as harmful as some people suspect they are? What is the driving force behind the trial? I mean, it must have some kind of future goal in mind.
I mean, I think the thinking is these things have been used now for such a long time. I mean, not widely in the UK, it has to be said, but, some thousands of kids have been given them. And there's such a strong feeling among so many parents and children that they are absolutely the thing they want. Like what I hear from skeptical therapists is that you can't talk to these kids. You can't actually try and do any sort of normal talking therapy with them because they're completely fixated on the idea that puberty blockers will save their lives, and they won't even listen to you otherwise. So there's this sort of feeling that these things are out there, this idea is out there, and the only way we can knock it down is to have absolutely cast iron evidence that these things are or aren't harmful. I mean, I think we have very good reason to think they're harmful. But you're not meant to do medical trials in those situations. You're only meant to do this sort of trial where you may or may not get treatment if the researchers are in what is called clinical equipoise, which means they're genuinely unclear as to what they think you should or shouldn't do in this situation. So presumably they found themselves, some researchers, who are willing to think that maybe puberty blockers are a jolly good thing, because otherwise they shouldn't ethically be doing it. But I will say what happens in these situations is people get tunnel vision. So the ethics panel will have been looking at this like, funding is already there for it. This is a treatment that's already being used or has been used and is still being used abroad. The questions you want to answer are things like, does this make mental functioning better? They're not stepping back and going, does any of this make sense? Because it doesn't. Wes Streeting, when he welcomed the announcement, he said that he would always be guided by the science. So he's kind of abdicated responsibility too. He said that, this technical answer, this RCT, it's like, my PhD is in mathematics and my second subject was statistics, and I used to work for the Royal Statistical Society for many years. So although I'm not a statistician, I've spent a lot of time talking to statisticians and writing articles and just explaining for a popular audience what they're doing. And he's fetishizing the RCT, the idea that, this is the thing, this will give us the answer. After this, no one will be able to say, anything except what this says. But that's not true, because this is 200 and something kids getting these drugs for 1 year or 2 years, when we want to know how they are in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Now, there aren't any kids to tell us that, but there are some who could tell us about 10 years.
It sounds to me, and I'm sure it sounds to a lot of other people as well, as like this is an experiment on children, almost for ideological reasons, or certainly that it feeds into an ideology which suggests that you can change sex, that children, as you said earlier, their lives will be massively improved if their puberty is blocked, if they are allowed to become the opposite sex, so-called. Do you feel the same way, that this is kind of almost like a mass experiment on kids? And then I guess that raises the question that you've already touched on, which is how on earth this got ethical clearance to take place at all?
See, if it's an experiment on kids, that's justifiable in some circumstances. It would depend what the alternatives are and whether you have
Right.
a plausible idea about what you're doing. I mean, if you think about kids who have cancer, you do horrific things to kids who have cancer. You cut off body parts, you give them drugs that nearly kill them, you sterilize them with drugs, But you do that because they're going to die otherwise. And in those situations, you might have very genuine questions like, what dose should you give of this drug? Is there a way we could give a bit less and not sterilize them? Is there watchful waiting? Is surgery better? Is radiotherapy better than chemotherapy? That sort of thing. You would do experiments on kids in these situations. So it's not that we're experimenting on kids, it's that the idea behind what we're doing is fundamentally dumb. And that idea is that people can be born in the wrong body. Now, they don't write that in the notes, like with the ethical approval, but what they talk about is children with, quote, gender incongruence. They don't define gender and they don't define gender incongruence, but all this can mean is something like kids who think that they aren't really their sex, but the things they are really their sex. Then it might mean kids who think they'd be happier if they were the opposite sex. Well, they might be, but they can't be the opposite sex. So it's a treatment pathway that's based on the idea that you can do something you can't actually do. And on top of that, like some people think, well, maybe what we're doing is we're just pretending. Like that these are people who, if we all pretend they're the opposite sex, they'd be much happier. I don't think that's true. Nobody's proved that. In fact, there's a fair amount of evidence it's not true. But more than that, after the 4 Women Scotland judgment in April, they can't live their lives in society at large pretending they're the opposite sex. So think what it means for one of the kids on this trial. So they're recruiting kids from when they start puberty, which may be as young as 8 or 10, to age 15. Because at 16 you can go on cross-sex hormones maybe. So you're in school. Most of those kids are in school. You go in, you have had your puberty blocked, and you're telling everybody that you're the opposite sex, presumably. You can't use the opposite sex's toilets. You can't go into their changing room. You can't do their sports. It's increasingly becoming clear you can't make everybody else call you the sex that you wish you were. So why the hell are we pretending? And then they grow up and they go into the workplace, or they play sport, or they go out into public, into places like swimming pools and so on. They can't do the thing that's available for the opposite sex. That's what 4 Women Scotland showed. So it's promising children a pathway that cannot lawfully be provided to them by the rest of society. I mean, we wrote to Wes Streeting and to the head of NHS England, we being Sex Matters, the organisation I work for, saying, you cannot offer children a treatment pathway that involves the promise that they can live as a member of the opposite sex, because they can't. Other people have rights too, and that's what the Supreme Court said. and we didn't get anywhere. So that's why we think it's unethical. Well, it's part of why we think it's unethical. And yet it's not something that the ethical panel will have considered. That's just outside their remit.
When you put it like that, I mean, I think the whole thing is a pretty bad idea and a disastrous idea anyway. But when you put it like that, which is that kids are being put on a pathway to just a mythical existence that they're never going to have, and they may well have a sad existence if they try to change sex as they would understand it, it really brings home just how catastrophic this trial might prove to be. But I wanted to ask you what we do know about puberty blockers, because when I'm reading the reports about this trial in London and the reasons behind it and why we need more information, which, as you say, the Cass review said, look, maybe if there is a controlled trial, we might get more information about these drugs. But we do know some things already, don't we, about the impact that these drugs have. I mean, just to be clear, they are used to treat precocious puberty, which can be a very distressing condition for very young children and for their parents. And I'm sure most people would agree that that's intervention in that situation is necessary. That can be a pretty debilitating condition. But what do we know about their use in so-called trans kids? What
Sure.
information do we have already?
I should say that Baroness Cass also said that there should be the data linkage study, which is what I'm saying about, following up. And
Right.
the adult clinics wouldn't cooperate with her. They wouldn't give her the necessary
Right.
data. And
Yeah.
that seems to have fallen by the wayside. And that's the first thing I'd have done if I was the health secretary, is I would have forced them to do that. And I would not even remotely have considered an RCT, exposing new children to these risks before I had squeezed all the data I could out of the kids who'd already had them. So these drugs, the one thing we know about them is they stop puberty, right? They literally just put you in suspended animation in terms of those physical developments. They're also used for, if you ever hear of somebody talking about chemical castration of sex offenders, that's the drug. They are used for some sex-related cancers, things like ovarian cancer. They're used for short-term, in very severe endometriosis. And in all those situations, the side effects are so unpleasant that they recommend using them only for short periods. So for endometriosis, they don't recommend you use them for more than 6 months because they basically put you into a state like menopause. So what they do, there's a complex interaction between the brain and the gonads that starts the process whereby your gonads produce more estrogen or testosterone. And estrogen puts you down the female pathway, testosterone down the male pathway. If you remember back to what you were like as a teenager, or if you have kids and you think about your teenage kids, this is like a turbocharged developmental period. Everything in your body changes, your brain changes, your risk appetite, your independence, your desire to get away from your parents, things to do with social stuff, your understanding of your own sexuality. That's when people start to become orgasmic. It's also when your ovaries or your testicles start to produce fully mature sperm or eggs. So you become fertile during that period. Obviously, men grow taller, your shoulders widen. So none of this stuff happens, none of it. Now, if you did this for 6 months or a year or even 2 years and then stopped, probably your puberty would pick up where it went. You would be behind your classmates. You would have missed out on some important developmental patch where you were kept childlike and they were growing up. But hey, we know they go on to cross-sex hormones. So if you do that, if you start on puberty blockers really early, like in the early stages of puberty, and then you go on to cross-sex hormones, we don't know exactly when because the experiment will be so unethical, but sometime probably around your 20s, your early 20s, you will be sterile. It'll never be possible to go through your own puberty again, even if you stop the puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So you will never have mature sperm or eggs. Women who are put on testosterone, it's not good for the female reproductive system. It causes uterine atrophy. It causes thinning of the lining of the vagina, so there's a lot of bleeding. You get more infections, yeast infections. A lot of women find that after some years on testosterone, they have to have a hysterectomy because the pain is so severe. And the boys, it causes shrinkage of and damage to the testicular tissue. So even if you came off, even if they're talking about doing counselling the kids about fertility. I mean, they're talking about counselling kids of 10, 12 about fertility preservation. I've done IVF. Both my kids were by IVF with my own eggs. I did 3 IVF cycles and I had 2 healthy singleton children at full term, so I'm one of the lucky people. They're talking about trying to explain all of this. Like I was 32 and 36, like that sort of age, to little kids. They're going to have to explain to them you probably won't ever have an orgasm. I think anyone who's talking to kids of 10 and 12 about orgasms really needs their hard drive checked. And anyway, suppose you wait for long enough to get fertile, like usable, storable eggs or sperm, and then you grow up. Like, what are you going to do with them? Especially the eggs. If you've had your womb removed, what are you doing with these eggs? Are you looking for a surrogate? That's not easy. It's a fantasy pathway. It's a fantasy that you can say to kids at 10 or 12, you won't orgasm, you won't be a natural parent, and by the way, the law won't let you pretend everywhere that you want to pretend that you're the opposite sex. All I can think is that the panel just didn't think of it in the round like this. So sorry, I know you asked me what we know about them, but I mean, that's what we know about them, is it puts you on this pathway. But the specifics, we have good reason to think that they leave you with weaker bones because you lay down a lot of the calcium in your bones during puberty, especially for girls. And also that they cause cognitive problems. I mean, those are from animal experiments. But like in sheep, they were able to tell after quite short period using them that the sheep weren't very good at finding their way, So again, just think about what puberty does and you're stopping that or interfering with that. You would expect it to have very wide-ranging effects right through the body and the brain.
Listening to you describe that, it's just the very thought of it is horrific. I mean, I've always thought puberty blockers for these purposes has been incredibly problematic, but you've outlined there just how bad it can prove to be in these kids. That's a useful overview of the kind of physical impact that these drugs can have on young children. But what about the psychological impact? Because am I right in thinking that even the Tavistock Clinic, I think, did a study which found that it didn't actually improve the psychological well-being in kids who were taking them? Because the thing that we're told, of course, and you've touched on this already, is the idea that they absolutely need these drugs to save their lives and become the person they're supposed to be. But the evidence doesn't even prove that there is a psychological improvement in the kids who have gender dysphoria and take these drugs, right?
That's right. So the Tavistock looked at, well, this data had to be winkled out of them with great effort, and by, among other people, Professor Michael Biggs, who was on the board of Sex Matters, who chased them to try and get the data out of them. But what we now know is that any extra suicidality, which means thinking about suicide or attempted or completed suicide, in the group of kids who have severe enough gender distress that they end up anywhere near a gender clinic, the excess suicidality is all due to the other things that are wrong with these kids. So kids who ended up at the Tavistock had a bunch of what they call comorbidities, so other conditions at the same time. So eating disorders, autistic spectrum disorder, self-harm, depression, anxiety. A very large share of them were gay, and it's a sad reflection on our society that gay kids, like gay teenagers, are much more depressed and much more likely to think about suicide than straight kids. So when you wash out all those other impacts, there is no excess suicidality. So there isn't anything to try to stop with the puberty blockers. And what they found now, I should have checked the exact numbers. I think that they had 3 suicides, but it might have been suicide attempts among kids on the waiting list for the Tavistock. And when they looked at other kids with similar problems who were being seen by mental health services, this was very, very normal and expected. Like tragic, but expected. So no, these are not life-saving. There's been further research come out from Finland recently that absolutely puts an end to that claim. No, they are not needed as a suicide prevention tool. And then the research that the Tavistock did itself showed that there wasn't any major improvement or even noticeable improvement in just general well-being and mental functioning. It's not like these kids who are often, they're school refusers and so on. It's not like they came back to life and, launched themselves into a happy social world again. I mean, you can see why. They've had their puberty blocked. They're not growing up and their classmates are growing up. And they're just waiting. They're just waiting for their cross-sex hormones. Like, it's putting kids onto this pathway where they're thinking, I need my puberty blockers, I'm waiting for them. I need my cross-sex hormones, I'm waiting for them. At some point in the future, I will be the opposite sex. And they never will be. I mean, it's so unkind. Like, they say they've been kind to kids, but it is so unkind.
I wanted to ask you what it means, I guess, morally or philosophically or socially, I guess, to block puberty, because you've touched on already how important puberty is in that kind of physiological sense. It's the moment at which girls become young women, boys become young men. There's still a way to go before you get become autonomous and a proper adult and the rest of it. But it's arguably the most important physiological experience in a person's life. I mean, it really does propel you from childhood towards adulthood. What are the consequences for a society that believes it's a good thing to prevent that from happening? I mean, to my mind, it's a form of child abuse to deny a child that fundamental natural right to become an adult in the way that everyone has done forever. I mean, it really is a kind of an abusive process in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually the second fastest developmental sprint because babyhood is the fastest. But I mean, I've often thought about this. Like as I say, I've had two kids, and the first few months are really hard because they're crying and you can't get any sleep and the rest. And imagine there was a way we could put them in suspended animation, for some weeks, so you could recover from the birth and maybe from your cesarean and so on, and you could just kind of park them. Surely your instinct tells you that this would have consequences down the line, you know? It's a bit like that. Like, you have to think that human beings are some sort of, I don't know, robot with a ghost living inside them, as opposed to actual living, breathing, fleshly animals that were evolved. Like animals with cognition and with moral sense and so on, but still animals. I call it the Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head vision of humanity. That you can just turn boys into girls by chopping bits off and adding bits on, and you can send someone down the wrong puberty. Like, that's what you hear often. You hear people say, well, they're just going through the wrong puberty. They need to go through the other puberty. You can't go through the other puberty. You haven't got the body for it. It's profoundly mechanistic and kind of hateful way of thinking about humans. I mean, I say it's a human rights abuse. Human rights is thrown around too much as a term, but it's a really profound human rights abuse because, like you say, it's your right to grow up to be an independent human being. It's your right to go through this process that turns you into someone who can go out into the world. And interfering with that, and in most cases, trying to send you down a pathway that your body actually can't go down. It just can't. You're not made for it. It's extraordinary, and it's an extraordinarily superficial way of thinking what you're trying to do. That rationale all along has been that it will make trans people pass better. So it was done, the first child was a girl, but most of the people it's done with are boys because testosterone is a very powerful drug. Like, testosterone is the one you can't really undo the effects of. So you can wait. There's literally no rationale whatsoever for doing this with girls. Because with girls, you can just take testosterone when you're older if you want, and you'll still look like a man. In this stupid rationale, I mean. I'm just saying, even in their own framework. But the boys, once the testosterone has done its job, they're never really going to look like women. So what they're doing is they're talking about making the boys into eunuchs, because that's what puberty blockade does. It turns out eunuchs. I mean, we know what to say about eunuchs when we were talking about the Chinese emperors. But that's what these kids, that's what this program should be called. It should be called the Eunuch's Trial.
Yeah, absolutely should. If we're going to speak plainly about what's going on, that's exactly what it should be called. What do you think this tells us about the state of the trans issue at the moment? Because it kind of suggests to me that it's like one step forward but two steps back, or maybe two steps forward but then one step back. I can't quite work it out. But the puberty blocker issue seems to suggest that there is a growing recognition in society that certain forms of intervention are problematic. And I think there's evidence for that. And this trial is being justified on the basis, although I still think it's wrong, but it's being justified on the basis that we need more information. But it suggests at the same time that the ideology is still out there. This notion that a girl can become a boy and a boy can become a girl, the idea that you can live as the opposite sex, that fundamentally false religion is still out there. And I think that's probably what this trial and the discussion around it points to, which is that society has become aware of over-intervening into these kids' lives, but at the same time, we haven't quite shaken off the idea that you can change sex. Do you think that that's still a serious problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, it's a hangover from the Cass report, which was groundbreaking at the time, but has
Yeah.
now been superseded. The recent report that's come out from the American government, HHS, what's that, Health and Human Services, I think, it's far better. Like, I'm not sure they would have been able to write it if Baroness Cass hadn't done her work, but it's far clearer and more consistent. And it has a chapter and a section on ethics in it, and it says that puberty blockers cannot be justified. So it's a bit unfortunate that we have this hangover from the Cass report, which is that, we need a trial. I'm not sure, was that trying to sound like you're even-handed at the time? Maybe it wouldn't have been as effective at the time if she had been less six of one, half dozen of the other about it. But what it tells me is sort of two things. Like, one is about the profound intellectual incoherence of the trans movement, because they're the people who say that your body isn't what says whether you're a man or a woman. I mean, they're the ones who say women can have penises and men can get pregnant. Well, if that's the case, why are we intervening with bodies? Like, what they should be saying to these children, if they actually believed their own mantras, is they should be saying, that's very nice, darling. Yes, you were assigned female at birth. Here's your pronoun badge, he, him. Off you go. You're going to be one of those men who has a uterus. And, equivalent for the boys. There's no need to intervene whatsoever. But what it does show is that there's, by now, in the water almost, or in the air, there's the idea that some kids are born in the wrong body. And that's going to be very, very hard to get rid of. Like, people do understand that you can't change sex, but they think that it may be kind to intervene for some tiny minority of kids, that they'll be better off if we all pretend and those kids need their bodies messed around with. And they think that the doctors are able to work out which ones it should be. And they do think that the treatments are on balance good rather than bad. Because, who are we to say that the doctors right from the start should never have been doing any of this? It's hard to accept that this is the equivalent of lobotomies. Because it is. It's something that we should just never have done. But it's something that we did to children. A lot of people have a sunk cost fallacy here. We've been doing this. That means, and we're not bad people. Therefore, this cannot have been a bad thing. Well, therefore, we must try and work out how to do it properly and to justify the children whose lives we've already harmed.
I wonder, what is it that makes certain sections of society cling on to this question so stubbornly? Because I do think it's almost like society is struggling to shake off the straitjacket of trans thinking. And lots of people are wriggling out of it and saying, look, we made some mistakes, maybe we were wrong. And obviously you and others have been at the spearhead of that for a long time and trying to bring society back to its senses on this question of sex and gender and women's rights as well. Other people seem to be realizing too, but there are sections of society that just are clinging onto it and won't let go. I mean, there's clearly lots of people at the BBC like that, which is why the BBC, even though it seems to be making an effort to be more even-handed, and even covered the Darlington nurses recently on News at 10, which was I couldn't believe what I was seeing on the news, but it's still beholden to this ideology and this idea to a large extent. There's the celebrity circle, which can't let it go and still wears all its trans badges and makes all those chants. There are people in the so-called liberal media who keep pushing this. There are still people who seem incapable of opening their eyes or even just rethinking certain things. What do you think is going on with that section of society?
I mean, two things. One is definitely the sunk cost thing. It sort of mentally fits into the pattern of overreach. Like, things went too far, now they need to come back, as opposed to that whole thing was a cult. This was, lobotomies or trepanning, or, it's got about as much validity as the theory of the humours in ancient Greek medicine, which lasted until the Middle Ages. But I think related to that, and sort of in broader society, what there is a very great unwillingness to say no to people. So when you talk to, as I have done recently, people who push gender medicine, especially gender medicine for children, they present themselves as kind. And they say how happy the children are when you give them what they want. Well, children want all sorts of things. And part of being an adult is saying no appropriately, kindly, but firmly to kids. And sometimes that'll make them very unhappy. Like, growing up includes a lot of unhappiness. Growing up includes working out that you're going to die, that your parents are going to die. It's coming to terms with your cat being run over. It's coming to terms with the fact that you can't have a lot of what you want in life, and you're going to have to choose within, the body that you were given, the time that you were given, the place that you were given. But people don't feel like saying that to children anymore. And I think it's so desperately unkind to let children hope for something that they can't have. And then moving away from the children front, we at Sex Matters, we've done focus groups, and, people really do understand that people can't change sex. But what they are very reluctant to do is to ever say to somebody who's very determined to be allowed, for example, a man to use the women's spaces or whatever, they're very, very reluctant ever to say no. They don't want to be rude, they don't want to be unkind, and they also don't want to be the one who has to make the decision. Which brings us back to, how did this ever get ethical approval? I think it's a failure of responsibility. I think a structural failure in that one, because no nobody ultimately took the decision. Like, Hilary Cass presumably felt that she had to, as a scientist, she had to say there isn't enough evidence here. Wes Streeting said, I'm the health secretary. I listen to the scientists. The ethical panel looked at a narrow question. Nobody looked more broadly and said, is this right? Is this good? Should we be doing it? And nobody put themselves forward to say, I'm going to try to stop it, knowing that I'm going to get attacked. So a failure to take responsibility, a cowardice, and an unwillingness to say no, very generalized, both with children and with adults.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting perspective, because it seems to me that there's a kind of twofold thing going on here. There's the science side of it, and I think there are lots of holes in the scientific claims of trans. I think it's mostly bullshit, if I'm going to be frank. But then there's also the social and moral side of it. And I think that's the bit that's still lacking, that the ability of society, or the willingness of society, to say no to children, and also just to state some basic truths, which you guys at Sex Matters do all the time, which is that you can't change sex, and that women don't have penises, and that's the end of it. I did want to get your sense of where you think the trans thing stands more broadly, because there have been, the Cass review was widely welcomed at the time, and I still think it was a positive step, even though we have this trial going on, and all the rest of it. We have the Supreme Court ruling earlier this year. I think some of Trump's executive orders on this issue were superb, just brilliantly written historical documents. Whoever wrote them in the White House, they were brilliant. The one on women's sports, keeping men out of women's sports, and the one on kicking gender ideology out of American educational institutions. Really good stuff. The Olympics seems to be coming to its senses on the question of men and women's sports, about time too. So there are positive developments. So, and I think a lot of that is down to Turf Island, which I feel very privileged to live on, and the women on this island who've been pushing this issue for a long time. Do you feel positive about how things are going, even given the fact that there are still some stubborn voices out there? Do you think it's going in the right direction generally?
Oh, definitely. And the other one I'd add to the list that you gave was the For Women Scotland judgment in April,
Yes.
which is absolutely foundational now in this country and has basically fixed equality law. But people aren't complying. Even the government isn't complying. Like, civil servants are still being told that they can use whichever toilets they want, when the law really doesn't permit that. So, yeah, all I can say is that this belief system spread while we weren't looking, and it's very entrenched, and it's changed the way people think. And also, you'd have to be mad to stand up to this, because it is enraging, and you do lose a lot by standing up to it. I say that as someone who did. So most people just decide it's not worth it. And the small number of ideologues who've made this their cause, for whatever reason, therefore are still making the running. And, while we weren't looking, policies got put in place, and policies remain unless you actively take them out. And just as a rule of thumb, I would say generally, a bad law or a bad policy will take you, conservative estimate, 10 times, maybe 100 times more effort to get out than it ever was to put in. So everywhere that's written a policy that says, it's hate speech to misgender, that means refer to someone's sex accurately, or everyone can use whichever toilets they prefer, somebody is going to have to put their neck on the line to change that, and the tiny number of people who don't want it changed, will kick up blue murder. And so people just think, oh, you know what? It's not worth it. I'll just leave it. It's only a few. It doesn't really matter. It's been like this for 5 years, 10 years, whatever. It's literally like trying to pull out bindweed. So we're going to have to do it the slow way, because there isn't any magic wand to wave here. Like, yes, we've reached the peak, but it's not. I think you'll often say, has the tide turned, but it's the wrong metaphor. Like, have we reached peak bindweed? I don't think there is any peak bindweed. Like, as a gardener, there's always more bindweed possible. And getting rid of it just requires constant persistence, because the wretched stuff comes back unless you keep going.
Do you worry about the backlash against the progress that has been made? I find it hard to read how deep the backlash is. I know it's very noisy and furious, but if you look at, for example, the protest that took place across the UK after the Supreme Court ruling, really nasty protests. I mean, there were people holding placards saying, "We'll piss wherever we want," which was hilarious because I thought that was such a male thing to say, and yet they were claiming to be women. There was a placard saying, "Hang J.K. Rowling," and there was all the usual kind of misogynistic stuff on these demonstrations. It seemed even worse than normal, I think, because these men, mostly primarily men, they were very noisy men, don't like being told no, as you said, and and suddenly this court ruling basically said no, you can't go where you want to go.
Yeah.
You have for the purposes of equality law in everyday life, you're a bloke, you're not a woman. So the backlash was quite intense, and I think we're seeing that in a few areas. Do you worry about how bad that backlash might be, or is it the death rattle of this movement, do you think?
I mean, it's only the death rattle if we continue and kill it. Like, it's definitely not dead. It's still there in the police. The police are still, you will have seen up in Scotland, there was a protest outside outside Holyrood, and the police decided to charge a woman who had approached a man who was playing his music so loud that the women couldn't be heard. He said that she had caused criminal damage to an umbrella. The umbrella was very, very visibly already damaged in the videos, and the police took this seriously instead of telling him to get off or else they'd charge him with wasting police time, which is what they should have done. So it's very embedded, and that will continue. But what I will say, the other thing you get from from doing focus groups, alongside this thing that most people don't want to be the one who says no, is most people wouldn't mind at all if the policies were sensible. Like, most people sort of think like, this is a minor issue until you tell them that this could mean a fully intact, ordinary physical man in your little daughter's changing room, stripping off, and her being the one who's told she has to leave if she complains. Then they get angry. They just mostly don't know that that's the case yet. But then if you said to them, well, what if the rules were very clear, it's your birth sex, almost everybody's fine with that. So if we get to a state where we have sensible rules and we're enforcing them, hardly anyone will complain. It's a tiny, noisy number who have been ridiculously pandered to in the last couple of decades, so they'll be furious. But there isn't widespread support. Like, when we turn it around so that it's obvious men demanding that they're allowed into spaces that the rules really clearly say they're not allowed into, they won't get any sympathy. Like, the moment they get sympathy because the rules are ambiguous or they've been framed as victims, but when they're saying things like, I'll piss wherever I want, and these bitches had better step aside, they won't get sympathy for that. The backlash I'm more worried about is the backlash against the LGB bit of the LGBT movement. We're already seeing that in America, and I think here too in opinion polls. The whole thing has been packaged up. They call it forced teaming when you attach yourself to a more popular movement. It's all there under the rainbow, the Progress Pride. There's a month for Pride now. People are starting to think, but this is tedious. Like, why do we have a month? One of the boys in one of our focus groups said, why do we have a month for Pride and only a day for the people who died for our country? I just thought, excellent question. This doesn't make gay people look good. And then there's a lot of people who think that this is out of feminism, that this all came out of feminism. And it's true that there's a particular idiot strand of feminism that's very supportive of all of this. So we're getting dragged down with this nonsense. Like, women and gay people are going to get dragged down with it unless we stand away from it. Those are the backlashes I'm worried about.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Those great gains of the 20th century, gay rights, more equality for women, I mean, they could really be pummeled if we don't sort out this kind of incredibly eccentric post-truth movement that has attached itself like a carbuncle to those movements. One more thing I wanted to ask you about trans kids, so-called trans kids. I don't think there is any such thing as a trans kid. We've talked about the danger of medicalizing these children and putting them on the pathway to essentially, infertility and possible ill health and psychological disorder through the use of all these drugs. But I wanted to ask you about the way in which so-called trans kids have also become symbolic in this whole movement. I mean, it's just an unavoidable fact that lots of celebrities have these so-called trans kids, far more than ordinary people. I would think, I don't have any statistics to hand, but I would think that the higher up in society you go, the more likely there are to be trans kids, amongst the kind of upper middle classes, where it's become a virtuous thing to nod along to your child's gender delusions or whatever, or even to implant gender delusions in them, whether wittingly or otherwise. To what extent does the existence of so-called trans children in those influential sections of society impact on our ability to get a handle on this issue? Because you've said this before, but it must be very difficult for the parents of these children to admit that they did something pretty bad to their children. So that's going to be a sticking point, isn't it? However far we might progress, there's always going to be
Yeah,
that problem.
yeah, absolutely. And my heart goes out to parents who are in this situation. I was just reading today a really interesting interview with parents, not well-off parents, not famous parents, actually two American pastors whose, what to me is very obviously a gay boy, and they would have been fine with that. Um, was so unhappy and was being bullied so much in school, and so saying he was so ill at ease in his skin that at some point, heart and mouth, they said to him, "Do you think you might be trans?" And he said, "That's exactly what I think." And now this family who live in a state where puberty blockers and child gender medicine is being blocked are considering that they're going to have to move to a different state so they can get the medicine they think is life-saving for their child. And this child is in a state now of mental distress that's so severe at the idea that this medication will be taken away from him and he'll have to, go back to a boy development that he has that he has shied away from. He is in a bad way, and they are going to have to move. So this family have become a huge, huge cheerleader for something that should never even have been on the table. Like, it should never even have come up. Do you think that you might really be a girl? That was in the water. I don't blame his parents at all. How are they to know? How are they to know what's the right thing to do when all the thought leaders and the tastemakers in our society are pushing this? I mean, I don't know that it's exactly the higher up in society. I think it's the higher up in things like media and publishing and entertainment, and probably in tech as well. All these institutions, in academia too, all these institutions that create the ideas that the rest of us have to live with have all bought into this. And they have trans children the same way that they have other status symbols. I'm sorry, like handbags. And I sometimes think when I look at them going on about their kids, it's just like the latest handbag. And so, yeah, they're polluting the pool. They're polluting the epistemic pool that we all live in. It's a big problem because, every one of those kids is somebody who is going to need and deserve special accommodations for the rest of their lives because they were misled horribly.
It's so true. Okay, Helen, my last question for you is, I think I've asked you this before, but I'm going to ask you it again because a lot has changed since we last spoke. But how optimistic are you, given what you've just said about, the problems that these young people are going to face for the rest of their lives, which is a serious problem for them and for society. But there have also been steps forward, which we've talked about too. I feel like the trans spell is being broken. I mean, we don't want to rest on our laurels. So there's still a lot of work to do. But it does feel like the genie's out of the bottle, and it seems probably that it can't be put back in, certainly without a lot of destruction in its wake. Do you feel optimistic about where this issue currently stands? And how optimistic are you that at some point in the relatively near future, we might finally put to bed this crazed ideology that has caused so much destruction?
I don't think you ever get rid of anything. Ideas never totally vanish. I mean, it's like eating disorders. Eating disorders along the American line, like classic anorexia, just literally didn't exist outside the West until the 1990s, and it got spread by social media. I'm old enough that I remember how it spread in schools, and it peaks, but it doesn't ever go back to nothing or near to nothing. Every terrible new idea we have about how minds and bodies work and how they interact with each other, what it is to be human. Once those ideas come out, I don't know how long it takes before they die. Like, how long? I actually don't know the answer to this. How long before people stopped trepanning? I literally don't know. A long time. The four humours lasted an awfully long time. So I don't think we can really put back into the box this idea that it's possible in some sense for a man to be a woman or a woman to be a man. That idea is out there now. What we can do is only have societal rules that mean that that belief system doesn't impact on the rest of us, which makes it less attractive to hold. Like, it's not very attractive to believe that you're a man who is really a woman if you're not allowed to use women's spaces. Stop it being children being indoctrinated. So absolutely out of schools, but then we have to accept the fact that we have a significant indoctrinated generation. Those people are leaving schools, leaving universities. They're going to go into HR jobs. They're already in the media. That's an entire cohort that we're going to have to live with now for decades. I mean, I'm optimistic in the sense that I think that we have made gains, But whenever I think about how much work there is to do to get rid of this terrible idea, I feel absolutely knackered. I always think of that thing that the social justice warriors say, "I'm tired, y'all." Like, I just go, "I'm tired, y'all." Like, of all the stupid things to have to fight. Like, it's literally as dumb as the flat earth. Like, it's literally as if we had decided, a significant portion of society, to believe that there was a flat earth and we were telling kids this and so on. And now we've got to try to undo that ridiculous miseducation and misinformation. And it's going to take us ages, and we could be doing something else more important instead.
Helen, thank you very much. Thanks again to PIA VPN for sponsoring this episode. Take control of your digital life and get PIA for 86% off. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code.